Hello everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, we'll be ranking all the presidents based on these 6 tiers I've put together because 2 days ago was President's Day. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't I just put this video out on President's Day? And the answer to that is, I forgot it was President's Day. It's a pretty useless holiday. I think it should be abolished. I think we should replace President's Day with Election Day and just make Election Day a federal holiday. And also, I was on a trip with my friends. I wasn't home, and even if I had my equipment with me, I was not about to stop and record a presidential tier list. So it's the 22nd. It's 2 days after President's Day. But let's talk about the presidents because I think, I enjoy doing this once a year. I always like to come back and see my lists from years past and, think, wow, I really have a different opinion of this president now than I, did 2 years ago, right? And there are many such cases of that. So let's look at these 44 men. I said 44. We'll talk about that in a second. And judge them, the good, the bad, the ugly. And yeah, we're just going to rank them based on these 6 tiers. So just to clarify, I'm not going to be putting Biden or Trump in this video. That's for a couple reasons. First, I think that you get a lot of strong opinions by ranking these guys. I have my opinions on them. I think, I think both of them have done a lot of bad things and some good things. But in the grand scheme of things, Biden's only 2 years into his term. We know he'll be serving at least another 2 years, potentially another 6 years. And Trump's running again, so we could see another 4 years of Donald Trump as well. And so, with that in mind, it's kind of silly to rank them, especially Biden, who has only had 2 years in his office. And both these guys have done a lot of stuff, especially Biden, who has been very legislatively productive. But the jury's still on whether or not it's going to be good legislation or bad legislation. So, without retrospect, I think it's a little early to judge them. But it is not too early to judge George Washington because he was president like 240 something years ago, or no, not 230 years ago or something like that. So we've gotten a lot of time to think about his presidency. And I used to not like George Washington. I used to think he was overrated. I used to think that we could have had a lot better. But, as I have read more about him and as I've learned, I think, more about the circumstances he governed in, I like him a lot. I think he's a very good president. And I know it's kind of a generic opinion to say George Washington good. It's what we're taught in school. It's what, the average American would think. But I'm going to go with the NPC opinion here. I think in this case, the consensus is correct. Washington, really had no he had no roadmap. He had no he shaped the office, and I think he did a very good job of avoiding hubris, of avoiding, corrupting it, because we could have easily, gone down a very bad path had we chosen, someone more egotistical or more polarizing to lead us. So I think Washington, well, he didn't do it, necessarily everything that I would have liked him to do, or even he had a lot of things that he did that I am not the biggest fan of. He, in the grand scheme of things, was basically the best guy for the job at that point in time and for that circumstance. And I'm glad that we had him because he was a unifier. He was someone who really embodied what we were as a country back then. Both, I know we're still far from perfect, and we certainly were not perfect in the 1780s and 1790s. But George Washington, to me, set the framework for this, for this role, and I think I don't think we could have asked for much more of him. I like George Washington. Plus, he defeated the British, and as any good American, would think, I'm very glad that he defeated the British. So that is why I like George Washington. Now, I don't really like John Tyler that much. He didn't do a ton, but he was a Confederate. He, was kicked out of his own party because he just was so contrarian to what they wanted to do. And I would have been a Whig Party member if I, were living in the 1830s and 40s. It was the Whigs and the Democrats back then, and I would have much preferred the Whig Party. They were more socially, forward thinking. They were much less pro-slavery. And in addition to that, they had better economic policies that, would have helped out the working class, the average American at the time, than the Democrats, who did not do that, as we'll talk about later. And Tyler, he was a Whig, and he, came into the presidency after William Henry Harrison died, but he was kicked out of his party. He was completely unproductive, and he was a traitor. He sided with the Confederacy, 20 years after his presidency in the Civil War. So not the biggest fan of John Tyler. Not awful, but he's a pretty bad president, in my opinion. So the next president, it's another 1840s, I believe, president, and it's James K. Polk. He was a Democrat. He defeated Henry Clay, who was a Whig, who would have had my support if I were 200 years old. And James K. Polk, I have a lot of mixed feelings on him because I think he was in many ways the right guy for the time because he had a mindset of controlling our own destiny within our country. But at the same time, he was very, very expansionist. He should not have gone to war with Mexico. He should not. And, he did it essentially because he wanted to expand slavery. And I know that's a very simplified version of what he did, but obviously the expansion of slavery was a bad thing. And in addition to that, we did not need to invade Mexico. There was no reason for us to, while, 200 years later, we have all that territory, which ended up being a net good for us in the long run, having that stretch of land from Texas all the way up to California. Good in the long run. We should not have done that at the time. And that's the judgment he made. So for that, I, don't love him. But again, long term, his presidency didn't harm us too much with slavery, at least specifically. And in addition to that, I think that he, under him, we had a fairly good economy in his policies. I think he was a Democrat, which, again, back then at least, not good, but not necessarily the worst person for the time, not at all. Zachary Taylor, I feel like we don't know enough about him. Um, Same with like I'll just do William Henry Harrison right now because we literally did not see enough of them at all. But again, Taylor was a hero from the Mexican-American War. He was someone who I think was honest, if not much else. He was a Whig, but he didn't really govern in a progressive or liberal manner. So I think he was all right, kind of a nothing burger. And Harrison obviously served for a month. Millard Fillmore, another kind of just mediocre 1800s president. He was just very, very generic. I don't really have much to say about him. I know he was a honest dude, and he did actually side with the Union during the Civil War. He was also, I believe, from Buffalo, New York, so that's not too surprising. But very average. Don't really have much to say about him. Although I will say that I think you can make an argument for bad if you wanted to, because I think that he was certainly someone who was not liked by his own party, the Whigs, who really had a lot of beef with their vice presidents when you think about it between him and John Tyler, and did not really govern efficiently. So, you could put him either. I'll keep him in bad, I guess, because we want to lower our standards here. Now, we're going to get our first awful here. Franklin Pierce. I think I'll talk about it at the end. I'll give my awards out at the end of the video because I'm doing that now. That's the new addition for this video. But Franklin Pierce is a contender for worst president of all time. First of all, he was, dude was from New Hampshire. He was still horribly racist. Like, back then the pro-slavery politicians were generally from the South and, at least had some economic incentive. Franklin Pierce was from New Hampshire when he was elected to the presidency, and he was, still up there with, among the most racist politicians in the country. He was, a very, he was riddled with tragedy in his personal life, which I guess you can give him a little bit of sympathy for that. But he was a very, very, at least from the interpretations of him back when he was president, he was extremely uptight. He was not good to work with. But none of that, that all pales in comparison to his legislation. He signed, most infamously, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed Kansas and Nebraska to vote on their whether they wanted to allow slavery or not because they were newly incorporated territories. And again, the Kansas and Nebraska Act, just for reference, was, I believe, 5 to 7 years before the Civil War. And again, Kansas and Nebraska, they each got to vote on whether they wanted to permit slavery. Nebraska was always going to vote against permitting slavery. Kansas, however, was considered to be kind of in contention. And thus, what happened was both Northerners and Southerners, Northerners opposed to slavery, Southerners pro-slavery, went into Kansas, tried to vote in the referendum, and ended up getting into an armed conflict. So we kind of had a mini civil war. They called it Bleeding Kansas. But Pierce, really, his presidency was just, he was racist, but he was increasing tensions between the North and the South. And I would definitely say that he, most certainly accelerated us on our path to the Civil War. And so for that reason, I view him as one of the worst presidents that we ever had. Just very ineffective, very divisive, and also had terrible, values. And the guy who came right after him wasn't much better. James Buchanan, I think, I've heard people call him the worst president. I don't. I think Franklin Pierce was worse because Pierce kind of set the bomb, and while Buchanan was unable to defuse it, he was not really as much of a net negative as Pierce was. But Buchanan was simply weak. He was opposed to slavery privately, at least from the accounts we've heard, and he still did nothing about it because he was a weak leader. And rather than attempting to be assertive and put forward any sort of compromise that would have kicked the can further down the road with the Civil War, he instead was just weak and essentially did nothing. And he also hated his job because he was in such a terrible position. Apparently, he allegedly told Abraham Lincoln something along the lines, when Lincoln was inaugurated, uh, I'm the happiest man in the world because, you cannot be as happy to gain the power of this office as I am to leave it. So that wasn't exactly what he said. It was probably in much more esoteric Old English, but certainly one of our weaker presidents, and I think just really did nothing to prevent what happened in the Civil War. And I'm now realizing that these next presidents are all, coming in some sort of order until John Adams, but that's besides the point. Abraham Lincoln, though, pretty easy, brilliant. I think one of the best presidents in history. Definitely was far from perfect, but he was great, I think, both on social issues and on economic policy. So first of all, he was a Whig, back before in the days that party existed. The party eventually collapsed, though, and he, was one of the first to join the Republican Party, which was, formed in 1854 in, I believe, Wisconsin. And so, Abraham Lincoln was, he dealt with a lot personally. He actually suffered from clinical depression. He had a lot of tragedy in his life, and he still, really did an incredible job as president. Between his handling of the Civil War, his, emancipating Black Americans, and really ending slavery. But he was also very good economically. He had very, I would say, popular. I don't want to say populist because I think that word's kind of lost its meaning, but he did a lot of things that incentivized working class Americans. It gave them better conditions to work in, but it also created uh, economic growth in the midst of a full scale war within the country. And so I think you know him handling the Civil War that well, him having that level of economic stability in the midst of that war, I think he's brilliant. He definitely is worthy of being in that tier, and definitely in the conversation for some of the best presidents. Unfortunately, one of his downfalls was picking Andrew Johnson to be his vice president, because after he was shot, Andrew Johnson was the president for 3 years, and that did not go well. He was never really ideologically close to Lincoln. He was, back in the day, he was pro-slavery. He then was, wasn't pro-slavery when he was president, but he was sympathetic to the Southerners and kind of let them get away with a lot. And under him, I shouldn't say under him because that wouldn't be technically correct, but the framework for the KKK was set. Domestic terrorism was common in the South against Black Americans, and Andrew Johnson really didn't do much about it. He was also just super racist, and I know I'm saying that a lot about these guys, and again, like George Washington, who have been brilliant, was definitely racist. He literally owned slaves, but again, for the time, right, I think pretty evident that we can't really hold that against him to that extent, but we can hold it against Johnson because he was, was president almost 100 years after Washington and was in a much different country and still made all the wrong decisions. So for that reason, I put him in awful. Now Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant is a guy I used to kind of like, but I'm putting him in bad. And the reason I used to like, and I think the reason that a lot of people do like him is because he was honest, and because, well, his administration, I think everyone agrees, was corrupt and had a lot of issues. People don't really blame it on him because they're like, oh well, he was a good guy, and I get that, and I think that I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, and he was a good general. But we're talking about his presidency here, and it was riddled with scandals. Most famous of which was the Credit Mobilier scandal, and it resulted in his vice president Schuyler Colfax being dropped from the ticket and getting in a lot of trouble. So didn't really have he also had a very bad economy and was just never productive. He was good, I think, on racial issues. He was like Lincoln in that he was opposed to slavery and did a lot of good stuff in the South, and that's why he's not in awful. But had one of the most chaotic and corrupt presidencies at a really bad time too. So I'll say Ulysses S. Grant as a president, as a person in general different, but as a president, quite bad. Now, after Grant, I believe was Rutherford B. Hayes, who, um, I don't, Rutherford B. Hayes is one of those guys I don't really have a strong opinion on, and I think you could put him in bad or average. I guess to even on the list, because same with Fillmore, I put Fillmore in bad. I guess I'll put Rutherford B. Hayes in average because I don't want to put too many guys here and kind of destruct the meaning of the tier. But what I will say about Hayes is that first of all, he was not his election was questionable. He lost the popular vote and, only won by one electoral vote. And again, we had complications in, I sound insane right now, but we had complications, I think, in a lot of states that he really should have lost. And they ended up giving the presidency to him through compromise. But, that's beside the point. And by the way, the compromise was bad because he ended up having to end Reconstruction. So he both won that election in a very controversial and questionable way. And when he won, the compromise hurt the country. So you could put him in bad for that. And the more I talk with him, the less I like him. But I will say, I think after that, his presidency was decently smooth sailing, was far from perfect, but I think he did a fine job, and he was, after the chaotic mess of Grant, he did a better job, kind of restoring integrity. To the office. Again, was far from, the best guy or really what we needed, but he was better than Grant and Johnson, and we'd have, almost 12 years of pretty bad presidents. So I guess for that reason, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. Now, John Adams, he'll be our first good. I like John Adams. I think that he was very, very strong in that he, first of all, this is one of my favorite things to say about John Adams. He was the first loser president, right? Like he was the first president to lose re-election. He was the first, guy who had to step down and transition the power. And as we've learned over time, peaceful transitions of power are often very hard and are often very stressful. And John Adams could have easily made it into a big thing. His election was close. It wasn't, it wasn't a blowout. It was a fairly close election. He had a lot of support when he lost that election to Jefferson, and so he could have easily stepped down. He could have easily made it into a big thing and caused a lot of controversy and tried to hold on to office because again, there was no groundwork for it. But he stepped down, accepted defeat with grace and humility, and I think for that he should be in the good tier. Policies, I think mixed bag. His Alien Sedition Act was, as we know, not great. But at the end of the day, he was a more progressive for his time. I think he did not own that many slaves, and I think he ended up freeing them. So I'll say he's in the good tier. I do wish he had gotten that second term because I want to see more out of him. But of the short period of time he was president, I think we were fine as a country. Now, this next one's going to be tough. James Garfield, because he was assassinated. And again, like William Henry Harrison, I don't have a ton to say about him because his term was cut short. And again, I do want, I don't want to draw this video out, so I think he's average. He didn't really do a ton in his presidency, and again, was unfortunately killed, I believe, a year and a half into it. Now, Grover Cleveland, or sorry, she's not Grover Cleveland. Chester Arthur was his vice president, and I don't like Chester Arthur, and that's for one reason, really. He was unproductive, but first, actually, no, I shouldn't say that. He was productive in one way, in that he wanted to ban Chinese immigrants from coming to the country, and created he set the precedent for decades-long anti-Asian discrimination within our country through his anti-Chinese legislation. But he also, was just so elitist. He was a snob. He was the equivalent of, that guy that won't stop talking with their money, because he allegedly owned, like, I don't even remember, but it was a ridiculous amount of clothing. He changed his pants and shoes 5 times a day. I've been wearing the same pants. I'm recording this at 5 in the afternoon. I've been wearing the same pants since 6:45 this morning after I got out of the shower. So, snobby dude, doesn't seem very likable, and also bad legislation. So, for my personal beef against Chester Arthur, I'll put him in the bad tier. But again, I don't know. I maybe he was a good president. I just don't. I just didn't read enough about him, and I just hate him because he was an elitist. But we'll put him in the bad tier just because it's my list. So after Arthur, we had Grover Cleveland, who, I have gone back and forth on him a lot. But what I will say is that his tariffs were quite interesting. Cleveland was very, conservative and Uh, he was kind of a pro-business guy. He was the last, I would say, like, of the, pro-business, because the Democrats after Cleveland took a really populist turn with William J. Bryan, the guy who unfortunately lost 3 presidential elections. But what I will say about um Grover Cleveland is that he was very anti-tariffs. He wanted to reduce them significantly because he was, you know, believed in, more of the free market and didn't prioritize, because tariffs essentially protect American industries and would make our products, more expensive on the global stage. Cleveland was against that because he was just like, let the market do what the market's going to do. And that was an attitude that proved to be very destructive long term, because we saw American manufacturing, even now we're feeling the effects of ideologies like this, because American manufacturing is now, depressed compared to where it was back in the day. We, are losing jobs to overseas, and Cleveland was one of the first people to not really see a problem with that. In addition to that, there were massive problems in the South in Texas, where Texas had massive problems with its crops and needed a redistribution of seeds to them. And he vetoed a bill that would have cost $10,000, which, in fairness, $10,000 is a lot more back then than it is now. But again, $10,000 to really save an industry in a big state with a lot of people, and he vetoed it. Just didn't make sense back then. It was pretty shocking back then. Still pretty shocking now. I think Grover Cleveland, I used to have a more favorable opinion of him. We're going to put him in bad. Benjamin Harrison, who ran against him twice, was, they were actually very similar. And, by the way, there are a lot of people who will tell you both parties are the same, don't vote. And those people are, people who spend 23 hours a day online and don't really go outside or don't care to do research on actual politics. But what I will say is that they would have been right if they lived in the 1880s, because these parties were very similar, except for the fact that Harrison liked tariffs a bit more than Cleveland. But his handling of the country was worse, and we had a very poor economy under Benjamin Harrison. So I think on tariffs he was a bit better, but his economic mismanagement cost us, and we had a recession a couple years after he left office. So Harrison, we're going to put in that bad tier along with Grover Cleveland. Just two horrible options in the 1880s. I would have not enjoyed voting. Although if I had to pick, I would say Harrison was maybe slightly better. I mean, maybe, the country voted for Harrison the first time and Cleveland the second time. So maybe I'll say I would have voted for Harrison the first time and Cleveland the second time. But we'll have, that matchup is truly a just horrible options. And again, people say the options today are terrible. Try picking between these two guys. William McKinley, he was a mixed bag. He had better economic policies than Benjamin Harrison, but he was a warmonger, and he set the precedent for the American Empire, or what I'd like to call the American Empire, where we, expanded that. Kind of like James Gipple, we expanded a lot in the early 1900s and the late 1800s. We took Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, our Pacific possessions, many of which, like Guam and the Northern Marine Islands, we still hold today. And he, essentially, the joke is that he blamed the Maine on Spain, because again, the USS Maine, which was a U.S. battleship, was blown up, and he blamed it on the Spanish when there's really no evidence at the time for that at all. So he went to war with the dying Spanish Empire. Honestly, we were beating a dead horse, because the Spanish Empire had peaked 400 years prior to that point. So we went to war with the Spanish, and we ended up, winning that war decisively, but really for no good reason. And what we did in the Philippines was just dystopian. I'm not going to talk about it here, but we committed many war crimes in the Philippines, and we were not kind to the people of Cuba or the Philippines. And he was just, he said we will not go into war until every agency of peace has failed. Clearly a lie, and clearly, he did not need to go to war with the Spanish. And so for that reason, I put him lower. But domestically, he had some, fairly decent things that he did overall. And now moving on to the next guy, his vice president, because again, McKinley was killed, unfortunately. I believe actually in, was it in Buffalo? No, but I know TR was inaugurated in Buffalo. I forgot where McKinley was killed. But Teddy Roosevelt, we're going to put in excellent. He's our first excellent president. Wow, I don't know why my mouse decided to lag like that, but he was a very good president. I think his trust busting mentality of sticking up for the little guy, making corporations pay their fair share, creating better conditions for American workers. Love that. Also, he was young, he was likable, he was charismatic. He actually was once shot, and he continued his speech even his chest was bleeding. Just like a really awesome guy. And the best thing about it is that he as a child was apparently very weak and was kind of bullied until he was sent out to live in, I think, the Dakotas, and he became a stronger, much more masculine guy who ended up riding hunting in Africa and being viewed as one of the coolest presidents of all time. I don't know if he's the best. He's certainly very good, but Teddy Roosevelt has quite the fan base nowadays among a lot of people. So I'll say Teddy Roosevelt, but goes in the excellent tier. Wasn't brilliant. I don't think he's quite up there with Washington or Lincoln so far, but he was very good, and I have very nice things to say about him. One of his like I said about Lincoln, one of his shortcomings was his vice presidential pick, or his actually pick to succeed him in William Howard Taft, who we're going to put in the bad tier. William Howard Taft, I think, is kind of memed because he was comically overweight, and he actually never did fall in the bathtub. I know people said that he fell in the bathtub. It was actually just a lie made up by his political opponents. So I do want to clear that up, because if someone lied about me, I don't weigh quite as much as William Howard Taft, but um, I have never fallen into a bathtub, and if the entire country thought I fell in the bathtub, I would want someone to stick up for me. So, William Howard Taft did not fall in the bathtub, but he did do worse things in terms of his legislation. He kind of rolled back a lot of the stuff that Teddy Roosevelt did with trust busting and making corporations accountable and really bringing them back down to earth where they should have been this entire time. He was, kind of an establishment figure. He wasn't really what we needed at the time, and he set the stage for an even worse president, Woodrow Wilson, who's going to go in the awful tier, because Taft became eventually so unpopular that he ended up setting the stage for Wilson. And by the way, Taft lost re-election. I'll show you the map because it's pretty interesting. But Taft lost every state except for, I think, Utah and Vermont. And rather than stepping aside and letting Teddy Roosevelt take the helm and beat Woodrow Wilson in that election, which he probably would have, because again, Roosevelt was very popular, Taft split the vote and came in third place. And we got Woodrow Wilson, who was also quite bad. He, first of all, was like insanely racist, even for his time. He showed the infamously bigoted film "The Birth of a Nation" at the White House. He, was born in Georgia and lived, as a young boy throughout the Civil War. But he had a lot of those tendencies and carried them with him, even as he moved up north to New Jersey and became president. Because Wilson, rolled back a lot of the progress we've been making with Wilson, with Roosevelt, McKinley, and whatnot, in terms of creating equal opportunities for black and white people in the South. And Wilson rolled a lot of that back. He was also kind of a socialist. He wasn't a socialist in the sense that he wanted to restrict the free market, but he was very much in favor of a more uniform society. And he signed the horrible prohibition laws that banned alcohol and ended up being disastrous for our country. And so for that reason, I'll put Woodrow Wilson in the in the awful tier. He really did not do much good, and I think that he, the fact that I was taught from a young, when I was in second grade, I learned about the presidents at my school. I thought Woodrow Wilson was a good president when I was a little kid because he gave women the right to voting. We won World War I, but really, as as we learned much later, or as I learned much later, was not a good president. Now, same with Warren G. Harding. He died 3 years into his office, but he was comically corrupt, and he appointed his friends to government positions. He kind of treated the presidency like it was a group sleepover, and it ended up leading to the Great Depression a few years later. So we're going to just call, Warren G. Harding, put him in the awful tier. And for some reason in this string of presidents, there's a weird break between him and Calvin Coolidge. Just to put in Thomas Jefferson's, we're going to go back to the late 1700s and early 1800s, talk with Jefferson. I think he was good. Very overrated president, in my opinion. I know he's on the $2 bill. He is, revered to be one of the better presidents in our history. I think he was all right, but he was very conservative. He owned a lot of slaves and was sympathetic to the South. And I know it was early in our country's days. I know he had to be a bit more of a peacemaker than we would have liked, Lincoln or Buchanan to be. But he certainly, to me at least, did not do enough in the role of the presidency to strengthen our, public or what was turning into public banking and just our these systems that we were going to govern our country with. And he actually was a big. I know a lot of people nowadays like Alexander Hamilton because of the play and because he's on the $10 bill and whatnot. And I like Hamilton too. If he was president, I think he would have done a fantastic job and would have probably been the second best of our founding father presidents. But what I will say is that he is just very. Jefferson was, had a lot of beef with Hamilton, and he did not take it to Aaron Burr level, but just him and Hamilton clashed on a lot, and I think that he was wrong on almost everything that they clashed on. I think Hamilton was in the right for most of those debates that they had about national bank and creating centralized systems of government in our country. But again, he wasn't disastrous long term. We ended up kind of doing the opposite of what he advised us, but he kept the country together and we prospered economically under him. So we'll put him in good. Calvin Coolidge, very overrated. I used to like Calvin Coolidge. I used to think he was a good president, but he was an isolationist. We, kind of saw a decrease in our world standing under Calvin Coolidge. In addition to that, we witnessed just a ton of like steps back in terms of where we were as a society with Coolidge. I know we had, the Roaring '20s and whatnot, but Calvin Coolidge was, he was infamously quiet, but like, I don't mean that I'm against quiet people, but he was not quite at the right time. He did not do anything to really advocate for, the mistreatment of black or to advocate to condemn the treatment of black Americans in the South by, at that time, a very prevalent KKK. And he also oversaw some, economic programs and, kind of economic, mismanagement that led to the Great Depression. I think Hoover was much more to blame, but, between him and Harding and Hoover, just really a string of presidents that laid off the economy and it ended up, backfiring horribly. So I'll say Calvin Coolidge, did some good stuff like giving Native American voters more rights, but that's really all I can think of. So we'll put him in the mixed bag tier for that one. Herbert Hoover, bad. Actually, we'll put him in awful just to be controversial here. His policies led to the Great Depression. He, first of all, he actively lied about his campaign opponent Al Smith, but his policies led to the Great Depression. He was, very quiet and kind of he wasn't very accountable. I think the perception of him was that he, kind of thought everything was going to work out for itself, but in reality, he clearly was not someone who was ready for the job or was, going to take the country to the level it needed to be at, at the time he was president. But luckily, we got FDR, and he's going to go with his brother in excellent. Last time I had him in brilliant. I don't think much has changed other than I think that he's just a tier down from Lincoln and Washington. And I say that because I think FDR was more of a mixed bag than I think I originally thought. The New Deal was a great program, and I don't want to criticize him here, but I think the Japanese internment camp's awful. And the way that, I'm not sure if he made the right pick dropping Henry Wallace from the ticket. I'm not sure if he made the right decision, in terms of how he conducted his, business as president. But we won World War II with him. He did get us out of the Great Depression, so that's, he's still excellent. And also, he started fireside chats. He was very, pro people. He was, accessible to the public more so than past presidents. He kind of set the scene for presidents becoming more public, more charismatic figures. So for that, I like him, and I think he was, going to go down as one of our best presidents for sure, even if I don't like him as much as I did last year. Just like FDR, we're going to put Truman in excellent. I like Truman. I think he was like FDR might be a little overrated. Truman's underrated. Harry Truman, first of all, awesome dude. Like saying his motto was "the buck stops here," and he was, he was accountable. He was honest. He was, I think, the right guy for the job in that regard. He had that dog in him. But in addition to that, he made a lot of really tough decisions that I think ended up paying off. First of all, dropping the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima, I think, to me, that was one of the toughest decisions you can ever ask someone to make. Literally, like, killing millions of innocent people who didn't really have anything to do with the war. But it was the right decision, because had we invaded Japan, the war would have dragged on for years. We would have, potentially, I don't think we would have lost, but we would have maybe had to sue for peace and, allow that horrible regime to continue to exist through the, mid 1900s. And we would have sent so many of our, young men to die in Japan, like would have maybe had millions more casualties, and that war was already just destructive enough. And, the Japanese were notoriously horrible people to fight against. They believe that once you surrendered, or, once they had possession of your body, you had fully, surrendered humanity to them, and they were just horrific, people to fight against. And I don't think we could have ever asked our young men, they were already brave enough, but an invasion of Japan would have been awful, awful. And so, while I wish we didn't have to drop the nukes on, Hiroshima and, Nagasaki, it had to happen. And I think that Harry Truman made a very, very stressful, tough decision, but I think he made the right call. And for that reason, I have a lot of respect for him, because, again, the buck stops here. Also, honest dude, very, good domestically, and he, I would argue, did well with the Korean War, with how we intervened in the Korean War. I think we did it the right way. We didn't, fully commit to it, but we did we did commit enough to stop North Korea from invading South Korea and, moving that boundary. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was right after Truman, I think he's similar. I'll say excellent. I don't love Eisenhower as much as I know a lot of people think he's like really good. To me, he's like, if there's a category between good and excellent, like if there's like a, pretty good, tier, I'd put him there. But, I guess I gave Truman the benefit of the doubt in the Korean War. I'll do the same for Eisenhower, just to be consistent here. Eisenhower, he was general in World War II, had that dog in him, just like Harry Truman. By the way, we had a string of really, really good presidents here, between FDR to Truman to Eisenhower to JFK. We'll talk with these guys too, but just, we were blessed with our presidents at that point in time. But either way, to me, Dwight Eisenhower is very, very, very competent. He did well with the Korean War, ending that, and, suing for peace. We didn't sue for peace, but the peace deal we got, I think, was, I'm content with it. We also we enjoyed a very good economy under him. I think, was also good for civil rights. He sent in the National Guard to enforce integration the admission of Black children into historically white schools. So for that, I give him a lot of credit. And I think just in general, he was someone who I think had the right intentions and ended up being a good president and a good man. Now, JFK, I think I'm putting him in good. A lot of people really like JFK. A lot of people say, no, he was excellent. Some people even have him in this top tier because they think he was, amazing. I think JFK was good. He was very, I think, brash and risky with his Soviet Union policy, because at this point we're now in the Cold War. But what I will say about him is that he did a good job in terms of, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were able to get a better deal out of that than I think we could have, easily gotten. And he also was good with civil rights. He was an ally, or I shouldn't say he's an ally, but he was, more of a friend to the Black community and to ending segregation in the South than he didn't, had to, because again, he won a lot of those states in the 1960 election, right? Like he won Texas, he won a lot of those states. And so he, I think, was above replacement route level. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see enough of him, but his foreign policy was brash, and I think we're starting to now learn more about his policies with the USSR, and I think we're starting to sour on him a little bit, but still a good president. Don't really have any hate towards JFK. Now, that said, I think that the guy that came in after him, LBJ, is going to go a tier higher. signed the Civil Rights Act, proponent of the Great Society, wanted to ensure, not through legislation, but through incentive, that Americans had better access to healthcare, was ahead of his time, was also apparently use the bully pulpit to his advantage. He, would yell at senators and tell them, vote for my bill or I'm going to make your life miserable. Sounds like an awesome dude to be around. But in all seriousness, again, the legislation he put through, Great Society, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, uh, you know, what he would have done with healthcare had he been elected to another term, I think was great. A lot of people give him, uh, a hard time because of the Vietnam War. I get that it was obviously a mistake in retrospect, but we were operating under a set of assumptions like domino theory that if we let Vietnam fall, it was going to be very rough for us. And I think that he had to go in. Like when he went in, uh, he had to go in. It was in the mid 60s at that point. Obviously by the 70s, and by the end of his term, he should have pulled out. And by the way, he did stop. He really toned it down in the final months of his presidency. But what I will say is that I think that a Lyndon B. Johnson gets too much heat for the Vietnam War, and I think definitely brings him down a bit, but certainly someone that I would consider to be an excellent president, and he's absolutely deserving of that tier, along with Dwight Eisenhower and Truman. Nixon, definitely a mixed bag. Totally a mixed bag. He was, he did some good stuff with the, creating the Environmental Protection Agency and being one of the first presidents to, I think, start to open the door. I mean, China was a mixed bag. His whole presidency was a mixed bag. But China was a mixed bag because I like that he was talking to Mao in his final days, and I like that he was starting to kind of create a healthier relationship between the cultures. But at the same time, he also led to us, starting to buy a lot of stuff from China, and indirectly he led to the rise of China, which obviously is hurting us nowadays. But he also, on top of the blatant dishonesty, was just a crooked politician, right? Like, you know, his implementation of the Southern strategy within the Republican Party, I think, ruined. No, I shouldn't say ruin them, but I think that it is still affecting us today, and it really divided politics along the lines of race in a way never seen before. And so the fact that he was just so incredibly, you know, okay with using race and catering to racist voters to just get his party to win elections, to me, very, very tough stuff. And he shouldn't have done it because, again, it's still affecting us to this day. Now, Gerald Ford, his successor after he resigned, don't love him. He pardoned Nixon. For that reason, he goes in bad. Didn't do much other than that, though. But, he kind of was a nothing burger. He's like a lot of the guys in bad or average, just didn't do enough to really get a good gauge for him. Jimmy Carter, who, by the way, I want to be sensitive because Jimmy Carter right now is in hospice. And first of all, as a person, Jimmy Carter is a phenomenal person, one of the best people to hold the office of presidency ever. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for Jimmy Carter, and I know he could potentially be in his final days, and I want to be conscious of that because I think that he, I hope nothing but the best for Jimmy Carter because he is a tremendous individual who deserves nothing of respect regardless of politics. Now, that being said, I do think that there are some things he could have done better in his presidency. I think, the economy became a big issue under him, and he also, I think, wasn't necessarily the right guy for the right time. I think he was, he was a peacemaker for sure, and that gives him credit. I give him credit for that, especially with what he did at Camp David, with the Camp David Accord between Egypt and Israel and whatnot. But I think he was weaker than I would have liked at the time, and Iran, the hostage crisis we had in Iran that began under his presidency, really created a lot of problems for us down the line with the guy after him. So, to me, Jimmy Carter, phenomenal human being, and I hope nothing but the best for him. But I think he's certainly a mixed bag of a president. James Madison, I don't like James Madison, and I will be first to admit it. I think the War of 1812, they called it Mr. Madison's War. It was his war. He didn't need to handle the British the way he did. We didn't need to go to war with them. It ended up, we almost lost that war, and they stormed our capital. It was like January 6th, just 200 years prior. So not the biggest James Madison fan. I think he just was not the right guy for the right time, and the economy was also not good under him. Now, going back to it's kind of weird because we're going in order for 6 or 7 presidents, then we go back to like some random guy from the 1800s. Back to Ronald Reagan. I hate Ronald Reagan. This is going to be like my take of the video. I think Reagan was a really bad president. And I know people in my family who love Ronald Reagan, and it's always, I don't really talk politics so much with my family, but it's always interesting to hear the perspectives on Ronald Reagan because they are divergent to say the least from mine. Reagan is the fun, I saw like I was scrolling on TikTok as all productive people under the age of 32. Sometimes I was scrolling on TikTok like a few months ago. The video is quite old by now, but um, it got like 200,000 something likes, and it was like this college student who was saying, yeah, aging is just realizing that the root of all your problems go back to Ronald Reagan, and I think that like that was like a 50% sarcastic post, and I obviously get that, but she's right. Like Ronald Reagan, um, his policies were his first of all his philosophy of trickle down economics was just never ever going to work, and his belief that we could just sell out American workers and not pay for it long term, completely ridiculous. Ronald Reagan's policies are the reason that we now see such expensive housing in college, and it's why a lot of young people like myself are having trouble. I don't want to say myself because I'm a high school student, but a lot of young people like myself in a few years from now are having trouble buying houses, paying college tuition, are not capable of financing themselves, and need a lot of assistance from their parents, right? And Reagan was also just his dealings with the Taliban are were hurting us up until 2021 until we left Afghanistan kind of just to fend for itself against the Taliban. So foreign policy, he was bad. I've talked about his domestic policies. He was bad on that. He was very racist. His acceleration of the war on drugs was just terrible. Really, in all honesty, he was someone who I think was very, in bad faith. He would, under him, we saw arrest rates of Black Americans for this, for the same size as white Americans. It was up by exponential percentages, and he also like I'm not going to put the graph up right now, but you can find countless statistics showing that wealth inequality was manageable in America until Ronald Reagan became president because of those trickle down policies that he implemented. The only good thing he did, and I'll give him credit for this one thing, which is why he's in bad and not awful, because I hate the guy. Only good thing he did was the arms race with the USSR. He knew that we were going to last longer than the USSR was in an arms race. I think he started, he kind of began the construction of the coffin that we buried the USSR in. And I am very obviously the USSR collapsing was a good thing for history. So for that reason, I think he goes above awful, but I would never vote for Ronald Reagan. I wish Carter and Mondale had beaten him, but he was popular in the 80s. Nowadays, he's a lot more controversial, but he was popular in the 80s. I'll give him that. George H.W. Bush, he was decent. I think that, he gets a lot of love because he was a lot more chill than Ronald Reagan. He was less. I think he was a better president than his son George W. Bush. But what I will say about just about Ronald or about George W. specifically is that he I think he did the right thing in intervening in Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, but I think that the deal we got was bad because Trump actually pointed this out in 2011 in Kuwait. We essentially led the liberation of Kuwait from Iraq's invasion, and nowadays we're paying for overpriced oil from them. And so I wish that he'd done something to negotiate better deals down the line from them in the future. Because again, Kuwait is rich with oil. He also, he oversaw. By the way, Reagan also was terrible for the debt. I forgot to mention that, but he oversaw a pretty big problem with the national debt that we are still, fighting today, and it's actually gotten worse since then. But overall, the reason he lost re-election was really because he didn't have a good answer on the national debt, and because he was unable to rein in fears about the economy. And I think the voters were right. I think that another term of George H.W. Bush would have, been very risky for our economic prospects. But I will say, he had his moments. I think he was a decent president, even if I do not love what he did. Bill Clinton, um, he wasn't good. I used to really like Bill Clinton, but I think that not screwing up because again, the economy under him, once he took control initially, got a lot better, and he kind of, he maintained it, so he gets credit for that. But I think that, him, what he did with the economy was partially him, but more a product of kind of having that split government, having a more cooperative Republican Congress, and also dealing with a, kind of a grace period in time in that the USSR had collapsed, but China and, China wasn't really as much of a threat as they are now. So I'll say that, Bill Clinton, to me at least, should go in the good tier. You can make a case for excellent, but I think that he goes in the good tier, just because I think he gets a bit overrated at times. Now George W. Bush, he's going to go in bad. He's like Reagan. I think foreign policy was disastrous. We should never have gone into Iraq. We should have also just at that point left Afghanistan, but he prolonged that war. And so I think for that reason, I really just hate his foreign policy all around. I also think that he was a bad president locally or domestically rather, because in the aftermath of 9/11, he passed a lot of restrictive legislation that violated like the Patriot Act, our personal privacy, and obviously the Great Recession. Oh, 07, 08, he became very unpopular in the final years of his presidency because of his terrible economic policies. And, he created a blue wave in 2008, despite the fact that Republicans had controlled the country for 8 years prior to that. So um, I think that his election results speak for themselves. Now, Barack Obama. I think we're still learning a lot about him. But what I will say is that I think he was a good president. You can make the case, I could say excellent, but um, I'll say he's good. I don't, he's recent. He's like the most recent president I'm ranking, so I don't want to be too controversial here. But here's what I'll say: Obama, he's someone who I think suffered from an increase in polarization, especially with the Republican Party, because he was demonized for a lot of things that really were not his fault. And he also, I think, received his fair share of racist attacks, especially early on in his presidency, because he was the first black president in our country's history. But here's what I'll say about Obama. The Affordable Care Act was landmark legislation. I think it was by far and away his single biggest accomplishment. Again, it was, he did it with a 60-seat Democratic majority, and he did it with, it was under revised terms for sure, but he got it passed. And I think that having that healthcare plan for a country as big as America is hard to do. And I think him pulling it off and is still really good for the country. He also, successfully recovered us from the Great Recession. We saw an influx in jobs under Obama. We saw sustained economic growth. We saw growth for the life expectancy. Overall, we had a really productive years under Obama. What I will say is that I think that he did not have the best foreign policy. He, again, like Bush, I criticize Bush for it, so I'll be fair, I'll criticize Obama for it too. I don't like how he handled Afghanistan. I don't like, what we did. I don't think we should have invaded Libya in 2011. And I think most notably now, at least, we did not have a response for Russia annexing Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. We should have had a much, Biden, to his credit, I know we're not talking about Biden in this video, but to his credit, Biden has coordinated a much more strong, unified response from the West. We were a lot weaker in 2014 as a bloc in the defense of Ukrainian sovereignty than we are now, although, again, different situations. But again, I think he made a mistake in not defending or not going further for Crimea. So that's why he's in good, not excellent. That specifically, I think, is a good example of his foreign policy blunders. James Monroe, he's good. We saw a pretty good economy under him. I think they called it like the golden age for us, because we were at peace. We had a very good economy, and we also just saw a lot of sustained growth. And so I think for that reason, you can easily make the case for putting Monroe in the good tier. I'm also going to put John Quincy Adams in the good tier. He was a nerd. He was famous because he liked, I think he liked planets and space, and he really enjoyed reading books. I know, what a loser, but he was a good president. He was competent. Although his election, I think, was only a byproduct of a deal made between him and Henry Clay. So I don't have much to say about him, but I think he was productive in the sense that he unified the country, and we saw, like Monroe, continued growth under him. And these final two presidents, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren. I'll talk about Jackson last. We'll get Van Buren out of the way. Van Buren was bad. We saw we'll give him bad because we saw Andrew Jackson, before him, but Martin Van Buren had a very bad economy. He was weak on issues with the South, and he also just was never really. He wasn't that guy. Like, we needed a stronger leader at that time to deal with the South and to start to unite the country again. And he was not that guy. So for that reason, I'll give him bad. You could say he's average because he didn't really do a ton outside of his economic problems. But I'm feeling mean today. We'll put him in the bad tier. Now, we're going to wrap up with another awful president. It's going to be Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, Trail of Tears was, I think, the most infamous part of his presidency. Obviously, his genocide of many Native American tribes in the 1830s, I think, with his forced relocation. He was, just a nasty dude. He was obsessed with war. He'd fought in wars. He was a hero in Florida because he'd fought many battles, both against the Brits and the Native Americans, and I think even the Spanish at some points in time. But, look, he was a very, very, I guess, polarizing president. He was kind of a bully to deal with, and he also, he set an interesting trend that he made the office of the presidency a lot more, kind of like for the people. Like, he invited. I think he invited the masses to his inauguration party where they got so drunk they had to be kicked out and served apple juice on the front lawn of the White House. But again, that it's cool that he was for the people and all, but it was not cool how he turned the presidency into a hubris machine down the line. So I think for that reason I'll put him in the awful tier. I can see myself putting him in bad, but his mass genocide of Native Americans to me is just so repulsive, and his economic policies, were nowhere near good enough to make up for it. So that's the list. Again, we're not ranking Trump and Biden here, so that's the list you're going to get for today. Now, I did say that I'd give out a few awards. So first of all, I think our best president was Abraham Lincoln. You could make the case for Washington, but we're going to give it to Lincoln. I think he was just more productive in less time, and even though Washington set a better precedent, Lincoln just was a better, no pun intended, president overall. Worst president, I'm going to give it to Franklin Pierce. Like I said at the beginning of the video, Franklin Pierce was just so bad in so many ways, and he was just the worst guy who could have had at the worst possible time. Now, most mediocre president, I'm going to probably give that to Rutherford B. Hayes. I literally have no opinions on the dude. I think he was just very average, so we're going to give that to him. Most underrated president, that to me, I think comes down to a couple of people. You could easily say John Adams. You could say Harry Truman, but I'm probably going to give it to Jimmy Carter. I think Jimmy Carter's, a lot of people really don't like Jimmy Carter because of his economic problems, but it really was never him. I don't think he was ever really the problem. So I think Jimmy Carter is going to be my most underrated president, but I think Harry Truman's a close runner-up there. So yeah, I can't really think of any more awards than the ones I'd already thought of. I guess, longest serving president goes to FDR, shortest serving goes to William Henry Harrison, but that to me is really all I've got to say here. Again, this video has gone for long enough. I'm getting tired of talking, and I, don't want to drag this on. So again, if you enjoyed it, please hit that like button. Give me your list so we can see who agrees, who disagrees, what your takes are, whether you think that my takes are completely invalid. Because again, on YouTube, if you disagree with one thing I say, that should be your comment, and you should hate me because of it. So yeah, let me know what you think in the comments down below, and I'll see you all in the next video.